I never thought the greatest betrayal of my life would reveal itself through a live stream. It was a bitter December evening in Chicago. I had just set my suitcase down after a grueling work trip when a message popped up from my niece, Emily. "You need to see this. Now." Attached was a link to a live video, and within seconds I found myself staring at my own mother, Margaret, seated at our family's dining table, wineglass in hand, laughing with relatives as she tore into me without knowing the camera was rolling. "Oh, please," she scoffed, waving her hand. "That girl thinks selling a few houses makes her successful. She flunked out of nursing school and now just floats around like a lost little failure." Laughter erupted from my aunts and uncles, the same people I'd grown up believing had my back. They didn't know, none of them did, that the reason I left nursing school wasn't because I couldn't handle it, but because Mom had collapsed at work and needed someone to manage her care. I gave up everything. My education, my savings, even my relationships. I worked 60-hour weeks to pay for her meds, her insurance, every specialist, every ride to the hospital. And now here she was, trashing me for sport at a dinner I hadn't even been invited to. I stood frozen in that hotel room, my heart sinking as I watched the people I once called family mock the very life I built to keep my mother alive. What they didn't know, what they would soon learn, was that this video didn't just break me. It woke me up, and I was done begging for appreciation. That night marked the end of my silence, and the beginning of something far more powerful. My return. 5 years ago, I was halfway through my second year in nursing school, excelling in my classes and finally feeling like my life had a direction I could be proud of. Ever since I was a teenager, I dreamed of becoming a nurse, not just for the stable career or the respect it carried, but because I wanted to help people in moments when they were most vulnerable. I believed that if I could ease someone's pain, even just a little, it would give meaning to the long, difficult road I'd walked with my mother, especially after my father passed unexpectedly when I was 16, leaving just the two of us to navigate life's hardships together. I still remember the call that derailed everything. It was early spring in Dayton and I was studying for an anatomy exam when my mother's co-worker called in a panic. Mom had collapsed at work, unable to move her joints, doubled over in pain. The diagnosis came swiftly and mercilessly: advanced rheumatoid arthritis. It wasn't just chronic, it was aggressive, painful, and would require ongoing, expensive treatments. I remember sitting by her hospital bed listening as she cried in fear, whispering how impossible it would be to afford the care she needed. Without hesitation, I held her hand and made a promise I would come to regret. "We'll figure it out, Mom. I'll take care of it." That night, I stayed up alone, staring at the ceiling in my tiny apartment, running the numbers in my head. I had a small savings account, a part-time job on campus, and a handful of scholarships that barely covered tuition. None of it would be enough. But real estate had always been something I dabbled in on the side. I had my license, and I'd closed 2 decent sales the year before. It was flexible, and with enough hustle, I knew I could generate the income she needed. I told myself I would pause nursing school just for a year, maybe 2, just long enough to stabilize her treatment and build a financial cushion. But a year turned into 5. Within months, I became her full-time advocate, coordinating her appointments, driving her to specialists 2 towns over, calling insurance companies so often I memorized the hold music, and covering every copay, every prescription, every physical therapy session. When her insurance refused to cover a specialized treatment, I liquidated my savings without hesitation. When she lost mobility in her left hand, I installed adaptive tools throughout her house. While other women my age were building families, buying homes, and climbing corporate ladders, I was sifting through medical paperwork, making spreadsheets to track out-of-pocket costs, and watching my 20s dissolve into someone else's crisis. And yet, I never once asked her for a thank you. Sometimes in her quieter moments, she'd murmur something like, "You've become so responsible," or "I don't know what I'd do without you." and those small acknowledgements were like drops of water in a desert. I clung to them because deep down, I wanted to believe that my sacrifices mattered, that my mother saw me, even if no one else did. It wasn't just about duty or guilt, it was about love. She had worked long hours to support me after Dad died. She'd put food on the table when we barely had enough for rent. This, I told myself, was how I repaid that debt. What I didn't realize was that while I was giving her everything, my time, my money, my future, she was quietly stripping me of something far more vital, my self-worth. I cancelled trips with friends, turned down promotions that would have taken me out of state, and delayed reapplying to nursing school year after year. There was always a reason. A flare-up in her symptoms, an insurance deadline, a therapy session she needed a ride to. And every time I thought I was close to reclaiming my own life, another wave of guilt would wash over me, pulling me back under. There were nights I cried silently after long days of managing house showings, reviewing contracts, and rushing to pick up prescriptions before the pharmacy closed. I'd crawl into bed exhausted, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was ever going to be more than a caregiver. I told myself I was strong, that this was temporary, that family comes first. But truthfully, I was drowning. No one in the family really knew. They'd see me at holiday dinners and compliment my entrepreneurial spirit, never realizing I was burning myself at both ends just to keep Mum afloat. They'd laugh and chat while I slipped into the kitchen to refill her tea or sort her pills. And I didn't complain, not because I didn't want to, but because I feared that if I opened my mouth, everything I'd buried would come pouring out, and I wouldn't know how to stop. Then came the live stream. That one video, those cruel words spoken without hesitation, stripped away whatever illusion I had left. It wasn't a misunderstanding or a bad day. My mother didn't respect me. Worse, she resented me. And that realization hurt in a way I didn't have words for, but it also gave me something I hadn't felt in years. Clarity. It was no longer about whether I was a good daughter or a dutiful caregiver. It became a question of survival, emotional, psychological, and spiritual. Because what's the point of saving someone who has no intention of saving you from herself? I must have watched the live stream 3 times in a row that night, not because I didn't understand what was being said, but because I couldn't quite believe it. Couldn't accept that the woman I had moved mountains for was so comfortable tearing me down in front of people who were supposed to be my family. The worst part wasn't the words themselves, though they were cruel enough to blister. It was the ease with which she said them, as if mocking me had become a kind of pastime, a harmless bit of dinner-table entertainment. My niece, Emily, had filmed the whole thing, likely thinking she was just capturing another slice of her everyday life for her growing social media channel. She had her phone nestled low, camera angled discreetly from her lap, and from what I could tell, she hadn't intended to catch anything scandalous. Not until my mother, buoyed by wine and surrounded by the warmth of people who validated her bitterness, decided it was time to speak her truth. She dropped out of nursing school like a scared little girl, she said, swirling her glass as if dramatizing a scene for television. Came home crying because the exams were too hard, then latched onto real estate like it was some grand career path. Selling houses? Please. Real success doesn't come in open houses and commission checks. There was laughter, soft at first, then growing, emboldened by the toxic rhythm of groupthink. My Aunt Dorothy added, "Well, at least she's not asking for handouts," to which my mother replied with a sly smile. "Oh, she doesn't need to. She just hides behind good deeds and expects people to clap for her." The comment stung like acid poured on an open wound, not because it was true, but because it was the furthest thing from the truth. And she knew it. What no one at that table knew, what none of them had even bothered to ask about over the years, was that I had covered every dime of her medical expenses. When her insurance denied coverage for biologics, I emptied my savings to make up the difference. When specialists raised their rates, I negotiated payment plans behind the scenes so she wouldn't have to worry. And when she was too tired, too sick, or simply unwilling to sort through the bureaucracy of healthcare, I took on the phone calls, the paperwork, and the emotional labour without so much as a sigh of protest. I had the receipts, literally. For 5 years, I'd meticulously documented every transaction, every claim filed, every bill paid from my account. Initially, it had been for tax purposes, a way to make sure I was at least somewhat protected if things ever spiraled financially. But now those folders, those spreadsheets, and those email chains had taken on a new weight. They weren't just documents. They were proof. Proof that I wasn't the disappointment she'd painted me to be, that my life wasn't some wandering mess of mediocrity, but a carefully balanced act of devotion, grit, and relentless endurance. As I sat in that sterile hotel room, blinds drawn against the icy wind howling outside, I felt something crack inside me. Not anger exactly, and not sadness either, but a kind of release, as if the years I'd spent justifying her behaviour, rationalising her cruel comments as tough love, had finally caught up with me and demanded a reckoning. I had always told myself that her sharp tongue came from pain, from illness, from years of stress she never knew how to voice. I had given her the benefit of the doubt for so long, I'd forgotten that even pain doesn't excuse malice, especially the kind that's delivered with a smirk over dinner. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Emily. "I'm so sorry, I didn't know she was saying all that until it was too late. Do you want me to take the video down?" I stared at her message, thumb hovering over the keyboard, and for a moment I imagined typing yes. I imagined going back to pretending that everything was fine, that my mother's love was just hidden behind layers of resentment she couldn't control. But then I thought about the sacrifices, the years of my life spent serving someone who had no idea how to cherish what was given. And worse, someone who, when given an audience, chose to humiliate me instead of honour me. "No," I typed slowly, "leave it up. I need you to see something tomorrow. I'm coming home early." The ride back from Chicago felt like a journey through fog. I couldn't remember packing my bags or checking out of the hotel. I barely noticed the grey, icy landscape flying past the window. All I could hear over and over was my mother's voice, that careless, dismissive tone, echoing in my mind, colliding with memories of her trembling in hospital beds, me clutching her hand and whispering, "You're not alone. I've got you." I had believed those words. I had lived them. And now, for the first time in half a decade, I was ready to stop. When I arrived home, I didn't head straight to her place or call to let her know I was back. Instead, I pulled out the thick binder labelled Mom Medical from my office cabinet, opened it on my dining table and flipped through pages of evidence. Insurance breakdowns, prescription costs, copay records, annotated doctor visits, handwritten notes from nurses thanking me for my advocacy. I stared at the mountain of proof I'd collected, and for the first time, I saw it for what it truly was. Not just a record of responsibility, but a testimony of a life I'd put on pause for someone who never once acknowledged the cost. I texted Emily, "Meet me at the cafe near downtown, 15 minutes. When she arrived, she looked nervous, guilt pressing down on her young shoulders like an invisible weight. She started to apologize the moment she sat down, but I gently stopped her, placing the open folder between us and sliding it toward her. "You didn't betray me, Emily," I said quietly. "You revealed the truth." Her eyes scanned the documents, growing wider with each page. This is over $100,000, she whispered, stunned. $124,327 to be exact, I replied, my voice calm, not because I wasn't hurt, but because something inside me had finally settled. That's how much I've paid for her care, and she calls me a failure. Emily looked up, her expression changing from shame to disbelief to something sharper. Outrage, maybe. "And now she laughs at you behind your back? After everything?" I nodded, not needing to say much more. "So, what are you going to do?" I didn't hesitate. "I'm done," I said, reaching into my bag for the legal papers I'd prepared weeks ago but hadn't yet signed, the ones that would remove me as her financial guarantor. "I've already started the process to separate my accounts. I've saved enough to reapply for nursing school, and I'm going to use that money for myself." It felt small in the moment, but signing those forms, transferring funds back into my own name, was an act of quiet rebellion. A statement. I had given everything, and now I was taking back what little I still had left. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I was clear. And that clarity would become my most powerful weapon. The days that followed were a strange, fragile mix of quiet clarity and steely determination. I spent the weekend at home, surrounded by stacks of paperwork, medical receipts, old email correspondences, and legal documents that I once filed out of obligation, now repurposed as building blocks for my liberation. For the first time in years, I wasn't organizing them to help my mother. I was disentangling myself from her, financially, emotionally, and logistically, in a process that felt equal parts exhausting and empowering. I began with the insurance. For 5 years, I had been the primary guarantor on every policy connected to her care, her prescriptions, her hospital visits, even her mobility aids. I called the provider and requested immediate removal of my name and financial responsibility from all accounts. The representative on the other end, polite but confused, asked if I understood the consequences. "Yes," I said, my voice calm. "I understand her premiums will increase and she may lose access to certain providers. That's her responsibility now, not mine." I didn't do it with spite. I didn't raise my voice or weaponize my hurt. I simply drew the line that should have been drawn years ago. And when the representative asked if I wanted the official notices sent to my address or hers, I didn't hesitate. "Send them to her home," I said. "She deserves to be fully informed." It wasn't about punishment. It was about reality. While the paperwork processed, I crafted an email, not to my mother, but to my extended family. I wasn't looking for sympathy, nor did I want to stir drama. I simply wanted the truth to be heard in my own voice before someone else twisted it into something unrecognizable. The message was direct and devoid of emotion, but every word carried years of silent sacrifice. "Dear family," I began. "After careful consideration, I have decided to step down from managing my mother's medical and financial care. Over the past 5 years, I have contributed over $120,000 toward her treatment, including premiums, prescriptions, and specialized therapies. I've attached full documentation for transparency. While this was a decision made with great difficulty, it is necessary for my own well-being. If any of you would like to assist her moving forward, I'm sure she would appreciate it." I reviewed the email 3 times, making sure every word reflected truth, not resentment. Then I hit send and closed the laptop. That night, my phone erupted. The fallout came swiftly, as I'd anticipated. My Aunt Loretta called me heartless. My cousin Derek sent me a string of texts accusing me of abandonment. An uncle I hadn't spoken to in 2 years chimed in to say I was acting out of character and that family doesn't give up on each other. What none of them realized, or chose to acknowledge, was that I hadn't given up. I had held on for far longer than anyone else would have, until my hands were raw and bloody from clinging to a person who was never going to meet me halfway. I didn't respond to any of them. I blocked my mother's number first, then slowly muted every voice that demanded my silence, but never offered me support. The absence of noise was jarring at first. For years, my life had been ruled by alarms, reminders, prescriptions, appointments, phone calls, check-ins, co-pays, and contingency plans. Without them, my calendar felt empty. But it was a different kind of emptiness. Not a void, but a clearing. And for the first time in a very long time, I had space to imagine something for myself. I returned to the acceptance letter I'd tucked away in a drawer months earlier, the one from St. Colleen's College of Nursing, inviting me to rejoin their accelerated program for returning students. I had deferred twice already, each time thinking, maybe next year, when Mum's condition stabilises, when the expenses go down, when I've saved a little more. But the truth was, I'd been waiting for permission that was never going to come, so I gave it to myself. I finalised my re-enrolment, scheduled a placement exam, and began mapping out how I could restructure my real estate business to accommodate class time. I wouldn't be able to maintain my full client load, but I had built enough goodwill and a decent referral network over the years to shift into a part-time boutique model. Fewer clients, higher value properties, and a part-time assistant to handle the admin load. It would mean less income, but without my mother's medical bills draining me every month, I could make it work. On the surface, nothing had changed. I still lived in the same house, drove the same aging sedan, wore the same work blazers I'd owned for a decade. But inside, everything was different. Every decision I made was now rooted in self-respect, not guilt. Every plan I laid out was designed to build something for my future, not maintain someone else's comfort. 3 days after the email went out, the official letter from the insurance company arrived, mistakenly sent to my address. I opened it briefly, confirming the updated policy terms and the drastic spike in monthly premiums, then resealed it in a new envelope, addressed it to her home, and added a single note inside. This was sent to me by mistake. You'll want to read it carefully. No signature, no emotion, just facts. I placed the envelope in the mailbox and with that small act felt the final threads of obligation loosen around me. I didn't know what would happen next, whether she would lash out or pretend nothing had changed. But I knew that whatever storm came, I would not be swept up in it. Because for the first time in 5 years, I had chosen me. And I wasn't looking back. 3 days had passed since I mailed the letter to her. I hadn't answered her calls, ignored her texts, and refused to engage with the barrage of guilt-laced voicemails she left at all hours. I knew she was confused at first, likely annoyed that I'd missed an appointment or hadn't responded about a medication refill. But confusion had now evolved into panic. By the 5th message, she was demanding answers. By the 7th, she was accusing me of cruelty. And by the 10th, she had reverted to the voice I knew best. Sharp, self-righteous, and full of wounded pride. You think you're too good for your own mother now? I turned my phone off and went back to studying, but she didn't stay behind a screen for long. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and I'd just returned from a property showing in Brookford, a quiet, tree-lined suburb where I'd started focusing my new real estate efforts. When I saw them, my mother and my Aunt Meredith standing beside a beige SUV in the parking lot of my brokerage office, their faces a mix of strained concern and brewing indignation. They had found me, and by the way my mother leaned against her cane, her posture more theatrical than weak, I knew this wasn't a casual visit. I thought about turning around. I really did. But something inside me, something rooted in 5 long years of invisible labour and silent endurance, told me to stay still. I parked. I got out of the car. I walked toward them without hesitation. "Genevieve," my mother said, her voice syrupy and sweet, the same voice she used on doctors when trying to secure early refills. "We need to talk." I didn't smile. I didn't soften. I don't think there's anything left to say. Aunt Meredith stepped forward, always the more diplomatic of the two. "Your mother's struggling, sweetheart. Her insurance just dropped one of her primary specialists, and her medication costs have doubled. She doesn't know what to do." "What I wanted," I said calmly, "was to be seen. What I needed was appreciation, not applause, not gratitude, but recognition of the sacrifices I made, the life I put on hold, the nights I stayed awake comparing treatment plans while working 60 hours a week. Instead, I got mockery. I got a room full of people laughing at my expense. I got betrayal." My mother's face paled. What betrayal? I've never... I saw the video, Mom, I said, my tone flat but unrelenting. Emily's live stream from the family dinner. I heard every word you said about me. I heard you call me pathetic. I heard you laugh about my career, and I heard them laugh with you. There was a beat of silence, then another. My aunt looked confused, and my mother looked suddenly 10 years older. Her voice wavered. You're twisting it out of context. I was just... venting. People vent. I gave a bitter smile. Venting is saying you're frustrated about a missed appointment. Venting is not mocking the only person who's kept you alive and afloat for half a decade. That's not venting. That's cruelty. Aunt Meredith turned slowly toward her. What video? She asked, clearly unsettled. My mother didn't answer. She looked at the ground, then at me, then back again. You're overreacting, she said, her voice rising, desperation bleeding through the cracks in her composure. You're my daughter. You can't just abandon me now, not when I need you most. And that was it. The moment I knew she still didn't get it. Everything I've done, I said, my voice quiet but pointed, I did out of love. But love that is not returned, love that is twisted, belittled, and exploited, eventually becomes something else. It becomes weight, and I've carried that weight alone for too long. She shook her head, her mouth opening in protest, but I raised a hand before she could speak. I've sent the full records to the family, I added. Every payment, every appointment, every insurance bill. They know, and if they choose to ignore it, that's on them. But I won't let this narrative, your narrative, define me anymore. Aunt Meredith looked from me to her sister, and for the first time, I saw doubt creeping into her expression. Patricia, is that true? Did she really? I'm sick, my mother interrupted sharply, trying to regain control. You can't expect me to be perfect when I've been in pain every day for years. I never expected perfection, I said, feeling years of buried sorrow rise but not overwhelm me. I only ever wanted kindness, a little respect, the decency of not being torn apart behind my back. She stepped closer. I gave you everything I had. No, I corrected gently. You took everything I had, my time, my savings, my dreams. You drained me, then blamed me for being empty. Aunt Meredith didn't say another word. She stepped back slowly, the reality settling in her eyes like fog lifting after a storm. My mother looked at me, no longer angry, no longer proud, just small. So what now? She asked. I stepped back. Now, someone else gets to step up. I wish you well, but I won't be manipulated again. I turned to leave. You can't just walk away from family, she shouted after me. I paused, my hand on the door handle. Family, I said without turning around, doesn't walk away from the people who carried them. So maybe ask yourself, who walked away first? Then I got in the car, started the engine and drove off. Not out of spite, not out of rage, but with a peace I hadn't known in years. And as the rearview mirror reflected the two of them fading into the distance, I realized something undeniable. I hadn't just survived her. I'd freed myself from her. In the weeks that followed that final confrontation, my life began to shift in ways both subtle and profound. There was no dramatic thunderclap, no Hollywood-style moment where I stood triumphant with my fists raised to the sky. But something far more meaningful happened. I began to breathe differently. Not the shallow, cautious kind of breath I'd gotten used to while living under constant emotional strain, but deep, steady, grounding breaths. The kind that come when you no longer wake up bracing for someone else's chaos. I immersed myself fully into my nursing re-entry program at St. Colleen's, balancing coursework and clinicals with my scaled-back real estate business. The transition wasn't seamless. There were nights when exhaustion settled into my bones, when my muscles ached from back-to-back property showings, followed by late-night study sessions, and when self-doubt crept in during pharmacology labs I hadn't touched in 5 years. But I pushed through, not because I had something to prove to anyone else, but because, for the first time in a long while, I had chosen this path for myself, and that simple truth made all the difference. I hired a part-time assistant named Kylie, a bright, eager college junior with a gift for client relations and a calm presence that reminded me to slow down and breathe. With her help, I was able to streamline my listings, focus on fewer but higher value clients, and carve out real time for my coursework and clinical rotations. I no longer worked out of desperation, but out of design, carefully curating a life that honored both my ambition and my healing. My family, predictably, remained divided. Some relatives still clung to the narrative my mother had fed them, one in which I was unstable, cold, or acting out of misplaced bitterness, while others, like Aunt Meredith, began to quietly drift back toward me, their messages tentative but laced with a different tone. One of curiosity, maybe even regret. I didn't chase their approval. I didn't explain myself. The truth was already out there for anyone who cared to see it, and I no longer carried the burden of convincing those who had never once paused to ask me how I was doing. My mother and I didn't speak. She moved in temporarily with Aunt Meredith after our encounter in the parking lot, and from what I heard, had started telling people she was the victim of emotional abandonment, carefully omitting the part where she mocked her only child on a live stream for public amusement. I let her talk. I didn't interfere. I had no interest in retaliation. What I wanted, what I needed, was peace, and that peace could not be built on battles I had already won in silence. Then, one day, a surprise came in the form of validation I hadn't expected. My broker, Mr. Harrington, called me into his office after a weekly meeting and told me I'd been nominated for the Resilience in Real Estate Award, an annual recognition given to agents who had managed to maintain or grow their business while navigating extraordinary personal hardship. I didn't know how to respond at first. I had never spoken openly at work about what I'd been through. I wasn't the type to wear my struggles like a badge, but someone had noticed. Someone had seen me. At the awards ceremony, held in a modest ballroom at the Glenwood Hotel downtown, I stood among peers who had faced their own hardships, cancer, loss, bankruptcy. And I felt for the first time like I belonged to something bigger than my grief. When they called my name, I didn't cry. I didn't stumble. I simply walked up to the podium in a navy blue dress I had bought just for the occasion, the first non-practical purchase I'd made in years, and took the crystal award in my hands with a calm, certain grace. This award, I began, my voice steady under the lights, isn't just about surviving hardship. It's about refusing to let it define you. For a long time, I thought resilience meant pushing through, keeping your head down, and never complaining. But I've learned that true resilience is quieter than that. It's in choosing yourself, even when it costs you everything familiar. It's in rebuilding, not out of revenge, but out of reverence for the life you deserve. Applause filled the room, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel the weight of all that had come before. Not as a chain around my neck, but as a staircase I had climbed, one painful step at a time. After the event, while driving home beneath the warm spill of city lights, I received a text from Emily. She'd just seen a clip from the ceremony on social media and had shared it with some friends. "You looked powerful," she wrote. She saw it too. I didn't have to ask who she was. Later that week, a call came from an unfamiliar number. It was my Uncle Daniel, a man who had barely spoken to me in years, but now sounded soft, almost reverent on the line. "Your interview with the Nursing Journal came across my feed," he said. "I read it twice. It's inspiring. I think a lot of us owe you an apology. I think I do." I didn't cry. I thanked him. We talked for a few minutes, and then I hung up, feeling both heavier and lighter somehow. As though the apology had arrived too late to change the past, but just in time to affirm the future I was already building. Now, 3 months into the semester, I wear my scrubs with pride, moving through clinicals with a renewed sense of purpose that surprises even me. I've found joy again, Not in grand cinematic moments, but in quiet ones. A patient smiling after a successful IV insertion, a thank you note from a seller who appreciated my transparency, an evening spent alone with a cup of tea and a good book without the weight of someone else's emergency pressing down on my chest. I don't know if my mother will ever truly understand what she lost, not just in me, but in the relationship we could have had if only she had chosen compassion over control. But I've stopped needing that understanding. I don't seek closure from people who refuse to offer kindness. Instead, I've built my own closure brick by brick in the life I'm now living. One I chose, one I earned. And that, more than anything she could have said or done, is the final chapter I needed. Not revenge, just release. And finally, peace. It's strange how silence, once feared, can become the very thing that heals you. 3 more months passed. I completed my nursing placement exams with distinction, reorganized my real estate work to support my new academic rhythm, and settled into a life that, while not free of challenges, was finally mine. Designed with intention, shaped by boundaries, and guided not by obligation, but by choice. I'd spent so long living reactively, to illness, to family demands, to guilt, that moving through my days with agency felt like a quiet revolution. The house was quieter now, the phones rang less, the demands stopped coming, and even the anxiety I had once thought was simply part of adulthood had begun to fade into something I didn't recognize at first. Peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on others behaving, but the kind you earn when you stop betraying yourself to be accepted by those who never truly saw you. Occasionally I would receive updates about my mother through Emily, or, less frequently, from distant relatives who still hadn't made sense of our estrangement. I didn't ask for those updates, but I accepted them with the same calm I had come to wear like armor. Apparently, she had cycled through multiple living arrangements, attempting to recapture the level of care and comfort I had once provided, but the reality of rising medical costs and dwindling sympathy had set in. She was learning, in the most honest and unfiltered way, what it felt like to depend on people who only show up when it's easy. One evening, as I returned from clinical rotations and placed my stethoscope beside the Resilience in Real Estate award that now sat modestly on the corner shelf, I noticed a thick envelope in my mailbox. It was addressed in her handwriting, the one I knew like the back of my hand, tight, slanted, and always in blue ink. I brought it inside, placed it on the table, and stared at it while drinking my tea. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Whatever apology or justification it contained was no longer relevant to the life I was building. I wasn't searching for closure from her anymore. I had created it for myself. A few days later, my Uncle Daniel called again. This time his voice was more measured, hesitant even. "She's been quieter lately," he said. "Less combative. I think maybe she's beginning to understand." I listened politely, but didn't respond to that part. I'd long stopped needing her understanding as a prerequisite for moving forward. "She saw your interview on Channel 7, he added after a pause, referring to a local news segment that had featured career changes in healthcare. "Didn't say much, but she watched the whole thing." "I hope she did," I replied, and left it at that. Weeks later, while packing my bag for a particularly long double shift at the hospital, I found myself glancing again at that unopened letter. It had become a symbol, not of reconciliation, but of release. I tucked it into a drawer, not because I feared what was inside, but because I no longer needed anything from it. If forgiveness was in there, it was too late. And if it wasn't, then nothing had changed. On a crisp Sunday morning, after finishing a shift where I'd comforted a man saying goodbye to his wife of 40 years, I stepped out of the hospital into the golden stillness of early autumn. The city was quiet, almost reverent, as if it too understood that something had been laid to rest, not with fanfare, not with vengeance, but with grace. I didn't win by proving her wrong. I won by proving myself right, by returning to the dream I had once set aside for someone else, by reclaiming the strength I thought I had lost, and by building a life rooted not in retribution, but in restoration. There's a quiet kind of revenge that doesn't scream or shatter or demand a spotlight. It just lives, steadily, intentionally, without apology. I've found mine. And now, I don't carry the weight of what she said or didn't say. I carry a stethoscope, a renewed purpose, and a future that no longer requires her permission. Call to action, CTA. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever sacrificed your dreams, your time, or your identity for the sake of someone who never truly saw your worth, know this: you are not alone, and you are not powerless. Subscribe to the Underdog's Revenge for more real stories of resilience, quiet strength, and emotional justice. And if you've been waiting for permission to choose yourself, this is it.